Well, now the U.S. State Department sponsored media apparatus is declaring that there were war crimes committed by Russian troops in the town of Bucha, just west of Kiev, now that the Kiev army has retaken that town. There are reports of bodies with bound hands and feet and mass graves being published in all the major newspapers in the US and France and Germany, even with accompanying pictures and satellite imagery of those bodies. I'm not going to say that Russian troops committed no atrocities. I do find the accusations dubious and opportunistic, since the very same media outlets screaming for war crimes charges and tribunals for Bucha have completely ignored the war crimes committed by Ukrainian forces in the 8-year civil war in that country that's been going on since 2014, in which the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or the OHCHR, has observed an apparent lack of motivation to investigate in some cases, especially when it concerns acts allegedly committed by Ukrainian forces. That's directly from their report. The report indicates that, yes, the pro-Russian separatist forces in the eastern Ukraine regions fighting against the pro-Western Kiev government may also have committed atrocities against members of the Kiev army, you know, the army that started the civil war against them, and pointed out the fact that rocket systems never intended for urban areas could be recognized as war crimes as they're used in urban areas, but there were no demands from the U.S. government or NATO or any of its allies for investigating any of those incidents in the past 8 years, especially not against the Kiev army and the neo-Nazis in them that were armed with those rockets to use against those ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. And there never will be, folks, because then they'd have to explain why the Civil War even happened, and that would force the US, EU, and NATO to face up to their coup in 2014. And the fact that the State Department sponsored media outlets are posting pictures of the gruesomeness of war to document these allegations of war crimes against Russia is interesting, because there were never any pictures of the highway of death in Iraq. You know about the highway of death, right? The result of American forces bombing retreating Iraqi forces from Kuwait, which it had invaded and annexed, and all its oil in August of 1990. Now, the United Nations Security Council urged all necessary means to force Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, of course, at the urging of the Western countries, angry that they didn't have access to all that oil any longer. Operation Desert Storm was launched on January 17, 1991, which decimated the Iraqi forces. The Iraqis realized they had no choice but to retreat from Kuwait and were reported to have committed atrocities against Kuwaiti resistance fighters themselves. But during their retreat from Kuwait, they were retreating. Beginning on the night of February 26th, Allied forces launched a combined ground, air, and sea assault on Highway 80, the main artery out of Kuwait, targeting Iraqi vehicles for 10 hours as they left along that highway. The Iraqi army was retreating. U.S. coalition forces targeted those retreating vehicles, bombing the highway incessantly for 10 hours. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed and left burning on the road, creating a huge and deadly traffic jam. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers were trapped in the carnage and burned to death. The international community was outraged, but not one war crime charge or tribunal was convened against the perpetrators, the U.S. and its coalition members. But whenever it's brought up, the highway of death, we're reminded of the Iraqi army's atrocities. With the quickness, though, it's probably easy to recount that Donald Trump pardoned 2 war criminals who were tried and convicted in military court for their crimes. 7 former platoon members accused one of the men, Navy SEAL Edward Gallagher, of routinely targeting women and children as a sniper in Iraq, as well as murdering a teenage captive in cold blood. And Nicholas Slatin is a mercenary who so far was the only man convicted of a massacre in Iraq of 14 civilians in 2007. But let's not act as if the war crimes committed by the U.S. government and its NATO allies are limited to those two men and their actions. The whole reason Julian Assange is in prison still, and why Chelsea Manning was imprisoned in the first place by the U.S. government, was because they released information exposing all the civilians the U.S. military were killing in Afghanistan, including the horrific collateral murder video of two U.S. Apache gunships killing a dozen people, among them many civilians and two Reuters staff members in a 2007 airstrike. Or how about the war crimes committed by the U.S. NATO allies in Libya? The report of the independent civil society fact-finding mission to Libya was published by the Independent Civil Society Mission to Libya, which was established by the Arab Organization for Human Rights, or the AOHR, in cooperation with the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, PCHR. Their report calls for the investigation of evidence that NATO targeted civilian sites, causing many deaths and injuries. Civilian facilities targeted by NATO bombs and missiles included schools, government buildings, at least one food warehouse, and private homes. The report presents evidence of systematic murder, torture, expulsion, and abuse of suspected Gaddafi loyalists by the NATO-backed rebel forces of the National Transitional Council, or the NTC. Now, the NTC is the opposition group that seemed to declare itself the legitimate opposition to Gaddafi in Libya, saying that they spoke for all Libyans, even though the organic protests in opposition to Gaddafi emerged in February 2011 were unorganized, locally based groups. The NTC quickly became the darlings of Western forces, receiving training from NATO forces, those nebulous advisors that always seem to be present in a country's unrest. The report describes the forced expulsion of the mostly black-skinned inhabitants of Tawerga and the ongoing persecution of sub-Saharan migrant workers by forces allied to the NTC and its transitional government. That's the slave markets, folks, that the NATO-trained NTC forces perpetrated in Libya. And let's not forget that the U.S. Department of Defense is the largest polluter of the planet on the planet. That, as far as I'm concerned, is a crime against humanity, since the pollution the U.S. military produces negatively affects the lives of millions of people around the world. All of these are war crimes. All of these and more are crimes against humanity. All of these have been documented to have been committed by the U.S., NATO, and their European allies. Should it be found that Russian forces have committed these heinous acts in Bucha, yes, they absolutely should be made accountable for them. But who's going to prosecute or sanction or even hold accountable in any way the U.S., EU, and NATO forces in any of their war crimes? No one. And that in itself is a crime against humanity. Follow Luqman Nation on patreon.com/LuqmanNation for lots of great content.